Every father worries he wasn't good enough, that he missed his chance to matter in someone's life. For 62-year-old Lone Eagle, that worry had turned into quiet certainty until a small girl changed everything. Living alone on the plains, this old warrior thought his story was finished. Then 8-year-old Birdie arrived at his camp with a letter from the daughter he never knew existed. She looked him over and said, "You're smaller than I expected. I requested a big man." But when Lone Eagle smiled and easily lifted a heavy, fallen tree, something shifted between them. Over the days that followed, she taught him that being a father isn't about size or strength. What happens when a man gets one last chance to discover what he was truly meant to be? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun hadn't yet painted the Wyoming sky when Lone Eagle rose from his bedroll, as he had every morning for the past 15 years. His joints protested the movement, reminders of battles fought in younger days when his body moved like water and struck like lightning. Now, at 62, he moved with the deliberate pace of a man who had learned that rushing only led to mistakes, and mistakes in this harsh country could mean death. His camp sat in a natural depression between rolling hills, hidden from casual view but offering clear sightlines in all directions. Old habits died hard, even in exile. The fire had burned down to coals during the night, and he coaxed it back to life with practiced efficiency, adding dried buffalo chips and kindling until flames danced against the morning chill. As he filled his dented coffee pot from a nearby stream, Lone Eagle caught his reflection in the clear water. Time had carved deep lines around his dark eyes, and silver threaded through his long black hair, which he still wore in the traditional way, despite being far from his people. His face bore the weathered look of a man who had lived entirely outdoors for decades, skin like tanned leather from countless seasons under the open sky. He settled beside the fire with his hand-carved pipe, a ritual that connected him to the grandfather who had taught him the old ways before the white man's wars changed everything. The pipe had been with him through every battle, every victory, every loss. Its smooth bowl fit perfectly in his weathered palm, worn smooth by years of contemplation. This was his meditation time, when memories of the past mingled with smoke and rose toward the morning sky. The memories always came unbidden, the weight of a war club in his hand, the thunder of hooves during raids against enemy tribes and later against the cavalry, the screams of dying men, both friend and foe, the taste of victory that always turned bitter in his mouth afterward. He had been known as a fierce warrior, respected and feared across the northern plains, but respect built on violence had proven as fragile as morning frost. It was the children's faces that haunted him most, not the warriors who had chosen to fight, but the innocent ones caught in the crossfire of conflicts they couldn't understand. After the last battle, a meaningless skirmish over stolen horses that left 3 young braves dead, he had walked away from his tribe, from his reputation, from everything that had defined him. The pipe smoke carried those memories skyward, where he hoped the spirits might finally grant him peace. His daily routine was simple and unchanging. After coffee and contemplation, he would check his small vegetable garden, tended with the same patience he had once reserved for tracking enemies. Squash, beans, and corn grew in neat rows, the 3 sisters that had sustained his people for generations. He had learned to find satisfaction in nurturing life rather than taking it. The worn leather pouch that held his most precious possessions lay beside his bedroll. Inside were the few things that connected him to his past. His father's knife, his mother's beading needle, and a letter that had arrived just 3 days ago, carried by a traveling merchant who had looked afraid to approach the camp of the notorious Lakota Killer. That letter had shaken him more than any battle cry ever had. Meanwhile, 200 miles away in the rough mining town of Copper Creek, 8-year-old Birdie had been preparing for the journey of her young life. Orphaned at 6, when consumption took both her parents within a week of each other, she had survived on the streets through a combination of wit, stubbornness, and the occasional kindness of miners who remembered having daughters of their own. Back east, Birdie possessed the sharp tongue and suspicious nature that came from learning too young that the world was not a safe place for small girls without protection. Her brown hair hung in uneven braids, cut short with a dull knife when it became too tangled to manage. Her clothes, a patched dress that had belonged to 3 other orphans before her, hung loose on her thin frame, but her green eyes burned. With the fierce intelligence of someone who had learned to read people as easily as wanted posters, the letter had found her through Martha, the kind widow who ran the boarding house where Birdie sometimes earned meals by sweeping floors and emptying chamber pots. Martha could read, unlike most folks in Copper Creek, and she had carefully explained the contents to the girl who had never known she had any family beyond her dead parents. "Says here your mama's name was Dawn Lightfoot," Martha had said, squinting at the careful handwriting. "And she's asking this man, this lone eagle, to look after you because she's powerful sick and can't do it herself." Birdie had stared at the letter as if it might bite her. "I never heard Mama mention no Dawn Lightfoot." "Well, honey, sometimes folks keep secrets about their past, especially Indian folks. White people ain't always been kind to them." The letter had included enough money for Birdie to buy passage on a supply wagon heading west, with careful directions to find Lone Eagle's camp. Dawn had also written a personal note to the girl, explaining that Lone Eagle was her grandfather, a man who had never known he had a daughter, much less a granddaughter. The wagon journey had taken 4 days, bouncing over rough trails that seemed to lead nowhere. Birdie had ridden mostly in silence, clutching the leather pouch that contained the letter and studying the vast landscape that was so different from the crowded, dirty streets of Copper Creek. The driver, a grizzled man named Pete, who hauled supplies to remote ranches and trading posts, had tried to make conversation. "You sure about this, little miss? That's rough country out there? And this fella you're looking for, well, he ain't exactly known for being sociable." "I can take care of myself," Birdie had replied, which was mostly true. She had been doing it for 2 years. "Maybe so, but Lone Eagle, that's who you're hunting, ain't it? He's got a reputation. They used to call him the Lakota Killer back in the day. Killed more white soldiers than any other warrior on the northern plains." This information had both frightened and intrigued Birdie. She had never known anyone famous, even if the fame came from killing people. "Maybe he's changed," she had said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. Pete had laughed, but not unkindly. "Honey, men like that don't change. They just get tired." Now, as the morning sun climbed higher, Lone Eagle spotted dust rising from the eastern trail. Visitors were rare, and unexpected visitors usually meant trouble. He set down his pipe and moved with surprising grace for his age to retrieve his rifle, an old Spencer carbine that had served him well in both war and exile. Through the shimmering heat, he watched a small figure approaching on foot, leading a tired horse. As the visitor drew closer, his weathered features showed surprise. It was a child, a young girl with defiant eyes and a determined set to her small shoulders. She walked with the careful confidence of someone trying not to show fear, and something about her reminded him of himself at that age. Birdie stopped 20 yards from his fire and studied him with the frank assessment that only children possess. She had expected someone larger, more imposing. The man before her was certainly weathered and strong, but he was no giant. His long hair was streaked with silver, and his clothes were simple, worn buckskins and a faded cotton shirt. He looked more like a hermit than a legendary warrior. "You Lone Eagle?" she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. He nodded slowly, not lowering the rifle but not raising it either. "I am. Who's asking?" "Name's Birdie." She reached into her worn coat and pulled out the leather pouch, holding it up so he could see. "Got something for you from somebody named Dawn Lightfoot." The name hit him like a physical blow. Dawn. the young woman he had known briefly during a trading visit 30 years ago. Beautiful, kind Dawn, who had shown him that gentleness was not the same as weakness. He had left her camp after only a few weeks, called away by his war chief to join a raiding party against the Crow. He had never returned, never even known her family name. "She your grandmother?" Birdie asked, watching his face change. Lone Eagle's voice caught. "I knew a Dawn long ago, but I have no family." "Well, seems like you do now." Birdie walked closer, extending the pouch. "She's sick, real sick. And she can't take care of me no more. Says in her letter that you're my grandpa, though I got to say you're smaller than I expected." I requested a big man. Despite the shock coursing through him, Lone Eagle almost smiled at her bluntness. Instead, he set down his rifle and accepted the pouch with hands that trembled slightly. The leather was soft and well cared for, and inside he found a letter written in a careful, educated hand that he remembered from their brief time together. But before he could read it, he noticed Birdie still standing in the morning sun, swaying slightly on her feet. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her lips were dry from the journey. "You hungry, child?" "I could eat," she admitted, trying to sound casual. "Sit by the fire, I'll make breakfast." As he moved around the camp, preparing beans and cornbread, Lone Eagle found himself stealing glances at this unexpected visitor. She sat with perfect posture despite her obvious exhaustion, her green eyes tracking his every movement. There was something familiar about the stubborn tilt of her chin, the way she held herself ready to fight or flee at a moment's notice. "How long you been traveling?" he asked, stirring the beans. 4 days on the wagon, then most of yesterday. Walking after it broke down. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand. "Horse threw a shoe about 5 miles back." Lone Eagle nodded toward her mount, which stood with its head down, clearly exhausted. "We'll fix that after you eat. Can't have you traveling on a lame horse." "You know how to shoe horses." "Man learns many things living alone." They ate in comfortable silence as the morning warmed around them. Birdie attacked her food with the focused intensity of someone who had known real hunger, but she also watched him carefully, as if trying to solve a puzzle. Finally, she spoke. "Dawn, my grandmama. She says in her letter that you didn't know about her having a baby, says you left before she could tell you." Lone Eagle set down his tin cup and stared into the fire. 30 years of wondering, of occasional dreams about the gentle woman who had briefly shown him a different way to live. And now this child appeared, claiming to be the granddaughter of a daughter he had never known existed. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "a man makes choices that seem right at the time, but prove to be wrong later. Mama always said, everybody makes mistakes. The trick is not making the same one twice. Your mama sounds like a wise woman." She was. Birdie's voice grew smaller. "She died 2 years ago. Consumption, same as got Grandmama Dawn now." The weight of loss in her young voice stirred. Something in Lone Eagle's chest, a protectiveness he hadn't felt in decades. This child had already known more sorrow than many adults, yet she sat straight and strong, facing an uncertain future, with the courage of a warrior. "Read me the letter," he said quietly. "My eyes aren't what they used to be." It wasn't true. His vision was still sharp as a hawk's, but he sensed that Birdie needed to feel useful, needed to be the one to deliver the message that would change both their lives forever. Birdie pulled the letter from its protective oilcloth wrapping, with the reverence of someone handling something precious. The paper was fine quality, better than anything she had ever owned, and Dawn's careful script covered both sides in neat lines. "My dearest father," Birdie read, her young voice giving weight to each word, "for that is what you are, though you never knew it. I hope this letter finds you in good health and at peace with the path your life has taken." Lone Eagle closed, his eyes letting the words wash over him. Dawn's voice seemed to speak through the child, reaching across 3 decades to touch his heart. "I was born 8 months after you left our camp to join the war party against the Crow. Mama never told you because she knew you would feel obligated to return, and she believed, as I do now, that a man must choose his own path to honor. Echo. Weight settled in Lone Eagle's chest, heavy as a stone. 8 months. He had left behind not just a woman he cared for, but his own child, growing in her womb, never knowing her father existed. Birdie continued reading, occasionally stumbling, over words that were beyond her limited education. I named myself Dawn Lightfoot when I learned to walk, for I always rose early to greet the sun and moved through life with quick steps and a light heart. Mama raised me with stories of my brave father, the warrior who fought to protect our people, but was too honorable to be tied down by obligations he had not chosen. She lied to you, Lone Eagle said quietly. I wasn't honorable. I was young and foolish, chasing glory instead of understanding what truly mattered. Should I keep reading? He nodded, though every word felt like a blade finding its mark. I married a good man, Robert McKinnon, when I was 19. He knew of my heritage, but loved me despite the dangers that came with being a half-breed woman in the white world. We moved to Denver, where Robert worked as a carpenter and I took in sewing to help support us. He adopted my daughter, your granddaughter Birdie, as his own, and we were happy for a time. Lone Eagle opened his eyes to study the girl beside him. So she was his great-granddaughter, not granddaughter. The distinction seemed less important than the blood connection that bound them across the generations. Robert died 3 years ago in an accident at a construction site. Since then, Birdie and I have struggled to make ends meet. I took whatever work I could find, but the consumption that took her parents has found me as well. The doctor says I have weeks, perhaps a month if I'm fortunate. Birdie's voice grew smaller as she read this part, and Lone Eagle saw her swallow. Hard before continuing, I am writing to ask not for forgiveness, for there is nothing to forgive but for a chance. Birdie is 8 years old, bright as a new penny, and tougher than rawhide. She has your eyes and your stubborn chin, and I see in her the same fire that must have burned in you as a young warrior. She needs someone to guide her, to teach her about her heritage, and to help her become the strong woman I know she can be. The old warrior felt something breaking open inside his chest, a dam that had held back 30 years of regret and loneliness. His daughter had grown up without him, lived her life, loved and lost and struggled and triumphed, all while he sat in exile feeling sorry for himself. I have enclosed a photograph of myself at age 20, so you might see the resemblance to your granddaughter. I also send the silver locket that belonged to my mother, your Dawn, which I want Birdie to have as a reminder of the women who came before her. Birdie reached into the pouch and withdrew a small, faded photograph and a delicate silver locket on a chain. The photograph showed a young woman with kind eyes and Lone Eagle's strong jawline, wearing a simple dress and holding the hand of a small girl who could only be a younger Birdie. The locket was tarnished with age, but still beautiful, engraved with tiny flowers around the edge. Inside, Lone Eagle knew would be a lock of Dawn's hair and perhaps a small prayer or blessing in the old language. There's more, Birdie said, turning the letter over. If you choose to take responsibility for Birdie, you should know that she is not an easy child to manage. She has lived through hardships that would break many adults, and she trusts slowly and loves fiercely. She will test your patience and challenge your authority, but she will also bring light into whatever darkness has settled over your life in exile. Despite his emotional turmoil, Lone Eagle almost smiled. The child sitting beside him had certainly already begun testing his patience. She can read and write better than most adults in our neighborhood, thanks to the kindness of a schoolteacher who took interest in her education. She knows basic arithmetic and has a gift for understanding people and situations beyond her years. What she lacks is knowledge of her heritage and the strength that comes from understanding where she belongs in the world. I do not ask this lightly, Father. I know that taking in a child would mean the end of the peaceful solitude you have built for yourself. But I believe, I hope, that it might also mean the beginning of something new and precious for both of you." Lone Eagle stared at the photograph, seeing his own features reflected in this daughter he had never known. Dawn had inherited his eyes and cheekbones, but softened them with her mother's gentle nature. And now that same combination lived on in young Birdie, sitting beside his fire, with dirt on her face and determination in her heart. The letters signed, "With love and hope, your daughter Dawn," Birdie finished. She folded the paper carefully and placed it back in the pouch, along with the photograph and locket. "So I guess that makes you my great-grandpa, not just grandpa." "I suppose it does." His voice came out rougher than he intended. "She also sent this." Birdie reached into her coat pocket and pulled out another item, a small medicine bundle wrapped in soft doe skin. "Said it belonged to her mama and her mama's mama before that. Said you'd know what it means." Lone Eagle accepted the bundle with trembling hands. He recognized the beadwork pattern immediately, traditional Lakota designs that told the story of a family's connection to the earth and sky. Inside would be sacred items passed down through generations of women, sage for purification, sweetgrass for prayers, perhaps a small stone from a holy place. This was not just a letter asking him to care for a child. This was his heritage calling him home to responsibilities he had abandoned decades ago. "She's really dying?" he asked. Birdie nodded solemnly. "Coughs up blood most every night now. Can barely eat. Mrs. Patterson, that's the lady who runs the boarding house. She says consumption always wins in the end." The weight of 30 years of separation pressed down on him like a physical burden. His daughter was dying, and he had never even known her name until this moment. She had lived an entire life, loved and married and raised a child, all while. He sat on these empty plains, nursing old wounds and ancient regrets. "Why did she wait so long to write to me?" "She didn't know where you were till last month. Some traveling preacher came through Denver, said he'd seen the famous Lone Eagle living like a hermit out in Wyoming territory. Took her 3 weeks to work up the courage to write the letter, and another week to convince me to bring it. And you just agreed to travel 200 miles to find a grandfather you'd never met." Birdie shrugged, trying to look casual. "It wasn't like I had anywhere else to go. Mrs. Patterson's been kind, but she can't keep feeding me forever, and winter's coming. Figured even a mean old Indian had to be better than freezing to death in an alley." The bluntness of her practical reasoning cut through his emotional turmoil like a blade. This child had faced the reality of her situation with the clear-eyed assessment of a survivor, just as he once had during the dark days after battle. "I'm not mean," he said finally. "Jury's still out on that," Birdie replied. But there was the hint of a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Lone Eagle stood and walked to the edge of his camp, staring out at the vast expanse of prairie that had been his world for 15 years. Somewhere to the east, his daughter lay dying while he sat in his self-imposed exile. Somewhere in the future, decisions waited that would change everything about the careful, solitary life he had built. Behind him, Birdie waited in silence, understanding, somehow, that this moment would determine both their fates. The wind carried the scent of autumn grass and the distant promise of winter. Soon the easy days of living outdoors would give way to harsh cold that could kill the unprepared. A child would need shelter, warm clothes, regular meals. She would need protection from the world's cruelties and guidance toward the woman she might become. More than that, she would need love, something he had locked away so long ago he wasn't sure he remembered how to give it. But as he turned back, toward the fire where Birdie sat clutching the medicine bundle, Lone Eagle felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't experienced in decades. Not the fierce joy of victory in battle, not the bitter satisfaction of solitude, but something warmer and more frightening, hope. The decision came to him not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual settling, like dust after a storm. Lone Eagle had spent so many years avoiding responsibility for others that he had forgotten the weight of it could also be a comfort. Someone needed him After decades of believing himself useless, except as an instrument of violence, he discovered that purpose could be found in protection rather than destruction. "We'll try it for a while," he said finally, turning back to face Birdie. "See how we get along." "What about Dawn?" The question carried more weight than her young voice should have been able to bear. "She's dying, and she doesn't know if you got the letter." The thought of his daughter spending her final days, wondering if her message had reached him, twisted something deep in Lone Eagle's chest. But the journey to Denver would be dangerous, for him and especially for a small girl. His reputation as the Lakota killer had earned him enemies among both whites and rival tribes. Federal marshals still carried warrants with his name on them, despite his years of peaceful exile. "It's too dangerous," he said. "Too many people want me dead or imprisoned. I won't risk your life for sentiment." Birdie's green eyes flashed with an anger that reminded him powerfully of himself at that age. "It ain't sentiment. It's family." Family. He tasted the word like something foreign. "I gave up the right to claim family when I chose war over everything else." "That's the stupidest thing I ever heard." Birdie stood up, small hands clenched into fists. "Dawn wrote that letter because she forgives you. She don't need you to keep punishing yourself for things that happened before I was even born." Her directness stunned him. Children, he remembered dimly, had a way of cutting through years of careful self-deception with simple truth. But truth didn't change the reality of bounty hunters and federal warrants. "For now, we focus on teaching you what you need to know to survive out here," he said firmly. "Winter's coming, and this country doesn't forgive the unprepared." Over the following days, Lone Eagle began the difficult process of sharing his camp with another human being. 15 years of solitude had made him set in his routines, and every aspect of daily life required adjustment. Birdie needed more food than he was accustomed to preparing, more water for washing, more blankets for warmth as the nights grew colder. But she also brought energy to his quiet world. Her questions came in constant streams. Why did he arrange his firewood in that particular pattern? What were those plants he gathered for tea? How did he know when rain was coming by the way the wind shifted? "My people survived on these plains for thousands of years," he explained, as they walked through the tall grass, searching for the roots and herbs he used for medicine. "Every plant, every change in weather, every track in the dirt, it all has meaning if you know how to read it." "Teach me to read it," Birdie said, scrambling to keep up with his longer strides. He showed her how to identify edible plants from poisonous ones, how to find water by following game trails, how to predict weather by watching cloud formations. She learned quickly but challenged everything, a habit that both impressed and exasperated him. "Why can't I just buy food at a store like normal people?" she asked one afternoon as they gathered wild onions. "Because stores are made by people, and people can disappear. The land is more reliable." "But people built stores because they're easier than digging around in the dirt for food." "Easier isn't always better. Easy makes you soft. Soft gets you killed." It was during these teaching moments that Lone Eagle began to understand the depth of cultural knowledge he carried, wisdom that had been passed down through generations and would die with him unless he shared it. The medicine bundle that Dawn had sent contained not just sacred items, but the weight of responsibility to preserve the old ways. He began each morning by opening the bundle and offering prayers in the Lakota language, something he hadn't done regularly since leaving his tribe. Birdie watched these ceremonies with curiosity rather than respect, which both troubled and amused him. "What are you saying to the sky?" she asked one morning. "I'm not talking to the sky. I'm talking to Wakantanka, the great spirit that lives in all things." "Does it talk back?" "Not in words, but if you know how to listen, you can hear answers in the wind, in the way animals behave in dreams." Birdie considered this with the seriousness she applied to all new information. The preacher in Copper Creek said there's only one God, and he lives in heaven, not in rocks and trees. Maybe the preacher was wrong, or maybe there are different ways of understanding the same truth, or maybe you're both making it up to feel better about dying. Her casual blasphemy should have shocked him, but instead it made him laugh, the first real laughter he had experienced in years. This child had the philosopher's gift for questioning everything and the survivor's instinct for seeing through uncomforting lies. "You might be right," he admitted, "but making up stories that help us live better lives isn't the worst thing people do." Their evening conversations became a ritual as important as morning prayers. Sitting by the fire after the day's work was done, Lone Eagle found himself sharing stories he hadn't told in decades. Tales of his childhood, legends of heroes and tricksters, accounts of great hunts and tribal gatherings that seemed to belong to another world entirely. Birdie absorbed these stories with the hunger of someone discovering her roots for the first time. But she also shared her own experiences, painting vivid pictures of life in Copper Creek, the rough mining town where survival depended more on cunning than courage. "There was this drunk miner, Big Pete, who used to chase me away from the saloon when I was trying to earn pennies sweeping up," she said one evening. "But I figured out he was scared of mice, so I'd catch them and put them in his coat pockets. After a while, he'd pay me a nickel just to stay away from his coat." "That's good tactical thinking," Lone Eagle said approvingly. "Use your enemies' weaknesses against them without direct confrontation. That's what you did in the war." The question brought him up short. He had been so focused on teaching her practical skills that he hadn't considered how his past might sound to young ears. To her, his stories of battle were probably no different from the tales of frontier lawmen she had heard in town. Exciting adventures rather than the bloody reality he remembered. "War is different," he said carefully. "In war, people die. The tactical thinking that kept me alive also got other people killed. Some of them were good men who were just following orders, fighting for what they believed was right. But you were fighting for what you believed was right too. Yes, and that's what makes war such a terrible thing. Both sides usually believe they're right. So how do you know which side really is right?" It was the question that had haunted him into exile, the reason he had walked away from everything that had once defined him. Sometimes you don't know until it's too late to change anything. As September moved toward October, their daily routine became more established. Mornings began with prayers and planning. Days were spent in lessons, survival skills, plant gathering, tool maintenance, and the gradual accumulation of supplies needed for winter survival. Evenings brought stories and conversations that helped them understand each other across the vast differences in their experiences. But even as they settled into this new life together, Lone Eagle remained constantly alert for signs of danger. His reputation had followed him even into exile, and he knew that eventually someone would come looking for the notorious Lakota killer. When that happened, he needed to be ready to protect not just himself, but the small, fierce girl who had become his responsibility. It was on a crisp morning in early October, as they worked together to repair the leather hinges on his camp supply box, that they saw dust rising from the eastern trail. 3 riders, moving with the purposeful pace of men on official business. "Get behind the rocks," Lone Eagle said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of long experience with danger. "Stay hidden, no matter what happens." For once, Birdie didn't argue. She had lived long enough on the frontier to recognize the tone that meant the difference between life and death. The 3 riders approached with the careful confidence of men who knew their business but weren't eager for a fight. Their leader wore a badge that caught the morning sunlight, a federal marshal, flanked by 2 deputies who kept their hands near their weapons, but not on them. Professional courtesy, Lone Eagle recognized, the kind shown to dangerous men who might be willing to talk before shooting started. "That's far enough," Lone Eagle called out when they reached the edge of his camp. His Spencer carbine rested casually across his knees, not quite aimed at anyone, but ready to be. "State your business." The marshal, a lean man in his 40s with prematurely grey hair, raised his hands to show he wasn't holding weapons. "Looking for a man called Lone Eagle, also goes by the Lakota Killer. You him?" "Depends on why you're asking." Got some questions about activities up north. Raids on supply wagons, attacks on settlers. Witnesses say it was Indian work, and your name keeps coming up. Lone Eagle felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach. He hadn't left this camp in over a year, except to trade for supplies at the nearest settlement, 40 miles away. Whatever raids these men were investigating, he had nothing to do with them. But his reputation made him a convenient suspect for any crime involving Indians and violence. "I've been living here peaceful for 15 years, he said. "Haven't raised a weapon against any man in all that time." "That may be," the marshal said, but 3 separate witnesses identified the Lakota killer as leading these raids. "Described you pretty accurately. Tall Indian with silver hair, wearing traditional buckskins, carrying that same kind of rifle. Witnesses can be mistaken." "Maybe so, but I've got 6 dead settlers and a federal judge demanding answers. You understand my position?" Lone Eagle did understand. The marshal seemed like a reasonable man doing an unpleasant job, but that wouldn't save either of them if this conversation went wrong. Behind the rocks where Birdie hid, he could hear the faint rustle of movement and hoped she had the sense to stay hidden no matter what happened. "What kind of raids?" he asked. "Supply wagons mostly, carrying goods between Fort Collins and the mining camps. Always hit the same way. War party of maybe 8 men, led by someone who knew military tactics. No survivors left to tell details, but the tracks and methods match your old style." The description sent ice through Lone Eagle's veins. It did sound like his old tactics, the lightning strikes he had perfected during the worst years of the Indian Wars. But more troubling was the number of men involved. A war party of 8 suggested organization, leadership, someone with authority to command warriors. "You got any proof besides witness stories?" The marshal reached slowly into his saddlebag and withdrew a piece of cloth, a red bandana with beadwork around the edges. "This was found at the last attack site. Witnesses say the leader wore it." Lone Eagle studied the bandana without touching it. The beadwork was Lakota, but the pattern was wrong. Too new, too bright, like someone had copied traditional designs without understanding their meaning. It was the kind of thing a white trader might make to sell to tourists, or that someone might use to implicate a particular tribe. "That's not mine," he said, "and it's not real Lakota work. Look at the pattern. Those symbols don't go together." "You saying someone's trying to frame you?" "I'm saying someone who knows my reputation is using it to cover their own tracks." The marshal dismounted and walked closer, keeping his movements slow and visible. "Mind if I look around your camp? See if there's anything that connects you to these raids? Look all you want. You won't find anything because I didn't do anything." For the next 20 minutes, the 3 lawmen searched through Lone Eagle's simple possessions while he sat motionless by his fire, the rifle still balanced on his knees. They found nothing more suspicious than his collection of medicinal herbs and the tools needed for frontier survival. "Your story checks out so far," the marshal admitted, returning to stand near the fire. "Camp looks like it's been here for years. And you don't have near enough horses or supplies for running raids, but that don't prove you weren't involved somehow." "What would prove it?" "Witnesses who could place you here during the attacks, people who've seen you regular-like, can vouch for your whereabouts." Lone Eagle almost smiled bitterly. 15 years of deliberate isolation had left him without alibis. The few traders who visited his camp came months apart, and he made no friends in the nearby settlements. His commitment to solitude, which had seemed like wisdom, now looked like the behavior of a man with something to hide. "I keep to myself," he said. "That's not a crime. No, but it's not helpful either." The marshal studied his face with the practiced eye of a man who had interrogated many suspects. "You know, I've been tracking criminals for 20 years and most guilty men try harder to convince me of their innocence. You just sit there like you don't much care whether I believe you or not." Would caring change the truth? Might change how this conversation ends. It was a threat wrapped in reasonable words, and Lone Eagle recognized the technique. He had used similar tactics himself when interrogating captured enemies. The marshal was a professional, which made him both more dangerous and more predictable than an angry vigilante would have been. "I'll tell you what bothers me most about these raids," the marshal continued, settling into what was clearly a prepared speech. "The leadership. Someone's commanding these war parties who understands both Indian fighting methods and military strategy. Someone with a reputation that can attract followers. Someone like the famous Lakota killer. Someone like me," Lone Eagle said. "But not me." "That's what you say, but reputations have a way of drawing men out of retirement, especially when times get hard for their people." From behind the rocks came the faintest sound, a small foot shifting on loose gravel. The marshal's eyes flicked toward the noise, and Lone Eagle felt his muscles tense. If they discovered Birdie, everything would become more complicated. A man living alone was suspicious, but believable. A man hiding a white child raised different, uglier questions. "Expecting company?" the marshal asked casually. "Just me and the wind out here. Funny thing about the wind, it don't usually wear shoes." The two deputies had noticed the sound as well and were moving to flank the rock outcropping where Birdie hid. Lone Eagle had perhaps seconds to prevent a situation that could turn deadly for all of them. "Birdie," he called out, making the decision that could save or damn them both. "Come out here." She emerged from behind the rocks with her hands visible, walking with the careful steps of someone who understood she was in danger. Her chin was raised defiantly, but Lone Eagle could see the fear in her green eyes. "Well now," the marshal said, softly, "this changes things considerably." "She's my great-granddaughter," Lone Eagle said, keeping his voice steady. "Her great-grandmother was dying in Denver, asked me to take care of her. Convenient timing. Pretty white girl shows up just when we're investigating Indian raids." The implication hung in the air, like smoke from a poisoned fire. Lone Eagle felt rage building in his chest, not the battle fury he had known as a young warrior, but the cold anger of a man protecting his family. "She's not a hostage," he said carefully. "She came here willingly, with a letter from her great-grandmother. I can show you." "Oh, I'd like to see that letter very much." Lone Eagle nodded to Birdie, who retrieved the leather pouch and handed it to the marshal. The lawman read Dawn's letter carefully, studying the photograph and examining the silver locket with professional thoroughness. "Letter seems genuine," he admitted, "but that don't change the fact that you're still our best suspect for these raids." "Then arrest me," Lone Eagle said. "Take me in for trial, but let the girl go to Denver where she belongs." "Can't do that. If you're guilty, she's a witness. If you're innocent, she might be the only person who can prove it." Birdie spoke for the first time since emerging from the rocks. "He didn't do nothing. He's been here teaching me about plants and stories and fixing things. We ain't hurt nobody." The marshal studied her with the same careful attention he had given the letter. "How long you been here, little miss?" "About 3 weeks. And before?" "You ask? No. He didn't steal me or hurt me or nothing like that. He's been nice to me, even though I can tell he ain't used to having kids around." 3 weeks. The marshal looked thoughtful. That would cover the time period of the last 2 raids. "But what about before that?" "I told you," Lone Eagle said. "I've been living here peacefully for 15 years. "So you say. But without witnesses, it's still just your word." The standoff stretched on as the morning sun climbed higher. Lone Eagle could feel the situation balanced on a knife's edge. These men had the authority to arrest him on suspicion alone, and once he was in custody, Birdie would be alone again, possibly sent to an orphanage or worse. But as he watched the marshal's face, he saw something shift, a recognition that perhaps came from years of dealing with both guilty and innocent men. "I'll tell you what," the marshal said finally. "I'm not entirely convinced you're our man, but I can't just ignore the evidence either. So here's what we're going to do. You stay put for now. Don't leave this camp for any reason. I'm going to send word back to my supervisor. Let him know about your situation. Meanwhile, I'll keep investigating these raids. If I find evidence that clears you, this conversation never happened. If I find evidence that points to you, you'll know where to find me." "That I will." The marshal handed the letter back to Birdie and touched his hat brim. "Take care of yourself, little miss. This country's not safe for young girls, even with a protector." As the three lawmen mounted their horses and rode away, Lone Eagle felt the weight of changed circumstances settling over his camp like a storm. Cloud. Their peaceful routine was over. Now they were being watched, waited for, judged by forces beyond their control. "Are we in trouble?" Birdie asked quietly. "We're in the middle of someone else's trouble," he replied, "which is sometimes worse." The encounter with the federal marshals changed everything about their daily routine. Where before Lone Eagle had moved through his camp with the relaxed confidence of a man in his own domain, now he remained constantly alert. His eyes swept the horizon regularly, and he kept his weapons within easy reach at all times. For Birdie, the tension was almost unbearable. She had lived through enough danger in Copper Creek to recognize when adults were preparing for violence, and the careful way Lone Eagle now moved reminded her of cats before they struck. But worse than the fear was the growing realization that her presence had made his situation more complicated. "Maybe I should go back to Denver," she said one morning as they prepared breakfast. "Find Dawn on my own. Let you get back to your peaceful life." Lone Eagle looked up from the fire where he was brewing coffee. "Is that what you want?" "Don't matter what I want. Matters what's right." "And what makes you think abandoning family is right?" The word family hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to build. In the weeks since her arrival, they had settled into patterns that felt almost natural. Shared meals, evening, stories, the comfortable rhythms of two people learning to live together. But neither had spoken directly about what their relationship meant. "We barely know each other," Birdie said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Blood doesn't require long acquaintance. And besides, you know more about me now than most people. I fought alongside for years." It was true. Their evening conversations had revealed more about his inner life than he had shared with anyone since leaving his tribe. She knew about his childhood, his fears, his regrets. She understood why he had chosen exile and what it had cost him. More surprisingly, she had begun to trust him with her own stories. The previous night, she had told him about the night her parents died, how she had held her mother's hand while the fever took her, how she had tried to wake her father the next morning only to find him already cold. The telling had brought tears she hadn't shed since the funeral, and Lone Eagle had simply sat beside her, offering the comfort of presence without trying to fix what couldn't be repaired. "Dawn's getting sicker every day we wait," Birdie said, returning to the practical argument that masked her deeper fears. "And those marshals will be back. Maybe next time they'll decide you're guilty whether there's proof or not. Maybe. But running won't solve the real problem. Someone is using my reputation to cover their crimes, and until we find out who, this shadow will follow us everywhere." As if to emphasize his point, they spotted another dust cloud on the distant trail. But this time, the approaching figure was alone, a single rider moving at the steady pace of someone covering long distances. As he drew closer, they could see he was an elderly man in a dark coat, riding a well-cared-for mare. "That's Reverend Mitchell," Lone Eagle said, recognizing the itinerant preacher who occasionally visited isolated settlements throughout the territory. "He's harmless, but he talks to everyone. Could be useful." Reverend Mitchell was a thin man, in his 60s, with kind eyes and the patient manner of someone who had spent decades listening to confessions and troubles. He accepted their offer of coffee and breakfast with the gratitude of someone who ate regularly, but not always well. "Heard there was some excitement out this way," he said after the initial pleasantries. "Federal marshals asking questions about Indian raids." "News travels fast," Lone Eagle observed. "Bad news always does, but I also heard something interesting in Fort Collins that might interest you. Seems there's a man there claiming to be a reformed warrior, telling stories about the old days to anyone who'll buy him drinks. Goes by the name of Black Wolf." The name hit Lone Eagle like a physical blow. Black Wolf had been his closest friend. During the warrior years, the man who had taught him advanced tactics, who had fought beside him in dozens of battles, who had been like a brother when the world seemed divided into us and them. "You sure about the name?" he asked carefully. "Sure." "Enough." Tall fellow, maybe 50 years old, with a scar along his left jaw. Wears his hair in the old way, but dresses like a white man. Real popular with the saloon crowds. Tells great stories about famous battles, especially ones involving the Lakota killer. Birdie looked between the two men, sensing undercurrents she didn't understand. "You know this Black Wolf?" "I knew him once," Lone Eagle said. "Long time ago." Reverend Mitchell leaned forward with the interest of someone who recognized a significant story. "He claims to have ridden with Lone Eagle during the height of the Indian Wars. Says he was there for some of the most famous battles, including the raid on Colonel Morrison's supply train that made the Lakota killer a legend." "What else does he say?" "Well, that's where it gets interesting. He tells folks that Lone Eagle went crazy after the wars ended, couldn't stop fighting even when there was peace to be made. Claims his old friend is still out there somewhere, leading raids, because violence is all he knows." The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Black Wolf wasn't just using Lone Eagle's reputation, he was actively destroying it, spreading stories that would make any violent crime seem consistent with his character. And worse, he was doing it in public, where the stories would spread and multiply until they became accepted truth. "There's more," Reverend Mitchell continued. "Black Wolf's got himself a following. Young men, mostly Indians, who can't find their place in the white world. He tells them stories about the glory days and how things could be that way again with the right leadership." 8 men, Birdie said quietly. "The marshal said the war party had 8 men. Lone Eagle nodded grimly. Black Wolf had always been a charismatic leader, and desperate young men were vulnerable to promises of purpose and glory. But leading them on raids that would inevitably end in their deaths, that was a betrayal of everything they had once believed about protecting their people." "How long has he been telling these stories?" Lone Eagle asked. "Started showing up in Fort Collins about 6 months ago, but I've heard similar tales from preachers working other towns. Seems like he's been traveling through the territory all summer, always with the same message about the Lakota killer still being out there. Building a legend to hide behind," Lone Eagle murmured. After Reverend Mitchell continued on his circuit, Lone Eagle sat staring into the fire long after the sun had set. Birdie waited in patient silence, understanding that this was one of those moments when adults had to work through problems too complex for simple solutions. "He was my best friend," he said finally, "closer than a brother. We saved each other's lives more times than I can count." "What happened?" "Same thing that happened to a lot of warriors when the fighting ended. Some of us found peace. Others couldn't let go of the glory. So what do we do now?" The question that had been building all day hung between them like a challenge. Black Wolf's actions had made their peaceful life impossible. Even if the federal marshals eventually realized they were chasing the wrong man, the damage to Lone Eagle's reputation would be permanent. And as long as Black Wolf continued using his name, more innocent people would die. "We do what we should have done weeks ago," he said. "We go to Denver, face whatever's waiting there." "What about the marshals? They told you not to leave." "They told me to stay put so they could find me if they needed to. But they never said I couldn't leave if I had good reason." "And what's our good reason?" Lone Eagle reached for the hawk feather he had been saving, a sacred item passed down from his grandfather, meant to be given only to someone who had earned the right to carry it. He held it out to Birdie. "This is for protection," he said. "My grandfather told me it would keep the bearer safe from harm, but only if they were fighting for something greater than themselves." Birdie accepted the feather with the reverence she had learned to show for his sacred items. "What are we fighting?" "For Dane family," he said simply, "and the chance to clear my name before it destroys any more lives." The preparation for their journey took 3 days. Each hour waited with the knowledge that Dawn's condition was deteriorating while they gathered supplies and planned their route. Lone Eagle approached the journey with the systematic thoroughness of a military campaign, understanding that they would be traveling through territory where his reputation made him a target for both law enforcement and vigilante justice. "We'll travel mostly at night," he explained to Birdie as they packed their few possessions. "Stay off the main roads, use game trails and creek beds where possible. It'll take longer, but it's safer." "How much longer?" "Maybe 2 weeks instead of 1, if we're careful." Birdie absorbed this information without complaint, though he could see her worry about Dawn's failing health. The previous evening, she had asked him to teach her prayers in the Lakota language, not because she had suddenly found religion, but because she wanted to be able to speak to her great-grandmother's spirit if they arrived too late. On their final morning at the camp, a package arrived with the weekly supply wagon. A small bundle wrapped in brown paper and addressed simply to Lone Eagle, Wyoming Territory. Inside, they found a letter from Denver and a small object wrapped in cloth. The letter was written in a different hand than Dawn's, weaker, more labored, as if each word required tremendous effort. "My dearest father," Birdie read aloud, her voice steady despite the emotion in the words. "I hope this letter finds you and Birdie well. I'm writing to tell you that my condition has worsened considerably. The doctor says I have perhaps 2 weeks, possibly less." She paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "I have enclosed my wedding ring, not the one Robert gave me, but the silver band that belonged to my mother, your Dawn. I want Birdie to have it as a reminder that love can survive even when people cannot." The ring was simple silver, worn smooth by decades of wear, with a small turquoise stone set in traditional Lakota style. It fit perfectly on Birdie's thin finger, as if it had been waiting for her all along. "I know the journey to Denver is dangerous for you," the letter continued, "but I find myself hoping desperately that I will see your face before I leave this world. There are things I want to tell you, stories about my life that I want to share, forgiveness I want to give and receive. If it is possible, if you can find a way to come safely, please know that you would bring joy to my final days." The letter was signed with a shaking hand. "Your daughter, who loves you, Dawn." They left the camp that afternoon, taking only what they could carry on 2 horses, Lone Eagle's sturdy gelding and the mare he had purchased for Birdie from a passing trader. Everything else, the comfortable routine of 15 years of solitary life, was abandoned to wind and weather. The first 3 days of travel passed without incident. They followed deer trails through broken country, avoiding settlements and main roads, stopping only to rest the horses and catch a few hours of sleep during the heat of the day. Birdie proved to be a capable traveler, complaining little about the discomfort and learning quickly to read the signs that indicated safe camping spots. But on the 4th night, as they prepared to cross the North Platte River at a remote ford, they encountered their first serious obstacle. A group of mounted men was camped near the crossing, too many and too well armed to be casual travelers. "Bounty hunters," Lone Eagle said after studying them through his field glasses. "Maybe 8 or 10 men, all carrying rifles. They're watching the ford." "Looking for us?" "Looking for the reward money on my head. Word must have gotten out about the marshal's investigation." They spent the rest of the night circling north, looking for another crossing point. But the river was running high from recent rains, and the few safe fords were all being watched. It was as if someone had anticipated their route and deployed men accordingly. "It's like they know exactly where we're going," Birdie observed as they watched yet another group of armed men from concealment. "Maybe they do." Lone Eagle's voice carried the grim recognition of a tactical reality. "Black Wolf knows me better than anyone alive. He'd know which routes I'd choose, where I'd cross rivers, how I'd approach Denver. So he's not just using your reputation, he's hunting us." "Looks that way." The realization forced them to change their entire approach. Instead of avoiding civilization, they would have to blend into it, hiding among the very people who might turn them in for reward. Money. It was a dangerous gambit, but their alternative routes were all blocked. They approached the town of Riverside at midday, when the streets would be busy enough to provide cover. Lone Eagle had changed into white man's clothes and cut his hair short, while Birdie wore a clean dress and bonnet that made her look like any settler child traveling with her grandfather. The transformation was remarkable. Without his traditional clothing and long hair, Lone Eagle looked like any weathered frontiersman. His features were still distinctly Indian, but mixed blood was common enough in the territory that it wouldn't attract immediate attention. "Remember," he said, as they rode slowly down the main street, "we're grandfather and granddaughter traveling to Denver for medical treatment. You have a cough that needs doctoring. I'm a retired Army scout. We keep to ourselves and don't start conversations." The masquerade worked well enough to get them through town and onto the main road south. But as they traveled, Lone Eagle noticed signs that made him increasingly uneasy. Too many armed men on the roads, all traveling in groups, all carrying the kind of weapons used for hunting men rather than game. "There's going to be trouble in Denver," he told Birdie that evening as they made camp in a hidden grove. "More trouble than just visiting a dying woman." "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that comes when too many people with guns are all looking for the same thing." As if to confirm his fears, they were awakened before dawn by the sound of gunfire. In the distance, multiple rifles firing in the coordinated pattern of an ambush. The shooting lasted only a few minutes, followed by the thunder of horses moving fast. "Should we go see if anyone needs help?" Birdie asked. "No. In this situation, anyone shooting at this hour is either a criminal or hunting criminals. Either way, we don't want to meet them." But when they reached the scene later that morning, they found the burned remains of a supply wagon and 3 graves hastily dug beside the road. A crude wooden sign stuck in the ground read, "Killed by Lakota Killer and his war party." Lone Eagle stared at the sign with cold anger. The wagon had been carrying supplies to mining camps, exactly the kind of target Black Wolf's group had been hitting. But more than that, the attack had happened while Lone Eagle was sleeping peacefully 20 miles away, giving him a perfect alibi that no one would ever know about. "He's getting bolder," Lone Eagle said, "and more careless. Sooner or later, he'll make a mistake that exposes him. What if he makes that mistake too late to save Dawn?" It was the question that haunted both of them as they continued south toward Denver, racing against time, illness, and the growing violence that followed Black Wolf's war party like a plague across the territory. That night, as they camped in another hidden spot, Birdie asked the question that had been building between them for days. "What if we're too late? What if Dawn dies before we get there?" Lone Eagle was quiet for a long moment, watching sparks rise from their small fire toward the stars. "Then we'll mourn her properly, and we'll make sure Black Wolf pays for using her death as cover for his crimes. And after that we'll be a family, the 2 of us, carrying forward what's left of our people's story." It was a promise that neither of them fully understood yet, but both recognized as the foundation of whatever future they might build together. They reached the outskirts of Denver on a gray October morning, with storm clouds gathering over the distant mountains and the smell of snow in the air. The city had grown considerably since Lone Eagle's last visit decades ago, sprawling beyond its original boundaries, with new neighborhoods of hastily built houses and businesses serving the mining boom. But it was the wanted posters that stopped them cold. They were everywhere, nailed to telegraph poles, pasted on storefront windows, tacked to the sides of buildings. Crude drawings of Lone Eagle's face stared out from dozens of locations, accompanied by bold text offering a $1,000 reward for his capture, dead or alive. "That's a lot of money," Birdie said quietly, studying one of the posters. "Enough to make every desperate man in the territory want to find me," Lone Eagle agreed. "But look at the details." The poster described him accurately, too accurately. Height, weight, distinctive scars, even the way he wore his hair and the specific model of rifle he carried. This wasn't information gathered from old army records or witness accounts. This was intimate knowledge, the kind that came from years of close friendship. "Black Wolf," Birdie said. "It has to be. He knows me well enough to provide details that would make these descriptions believable to bounty hunters." But there was something else bothering Lone Eagle about the posters, a nagging sense that the situation was more complex than simple betrayal by an old friend. The reward amount was unusually high, and the dead or alive specification suggested someone with serious money and serious motivation was behind the hunt. They found lodging at a small boarding house on the edge of town, where Lone Eagle's appearance as a weathered frontiersman wouldn't attract immediate attention. The proprietor, a stout woman named Mrs. O'Brien, seemed more interested in their ability to pay in advance than in their personal history. "We're looking for someone," Lone Eagle told her as she showed them to their room. "A woman named Dawn. Lightfoot, probably staying in one of the boarding houses near the hospital district." Mrs. O'Brien's expression softened with sympathy. "Ah, you'd be family then. Poor dear's been asking after relatives for weeks now. She's at Henderson's place on Colfax Street, but—" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "You'll want to visit soon, if you take my meaning." They found Henderson's boarding house easily enough, a respectable establishment that catered to long-term residents who needed medical care. But as they approached the front door, Lone Eagle noticed something that made his blood run cold. Two men lounged casually on the front porch, ostensibly reading newspapers, but actually watching everyone who entered or left the building. Their positioning and behavior marked them clearly as surveillance, and the bulges under their coats indicated they were well armed. "Federal marshals?" Birdie whispered. "Maybe. Or bounty hunters. Either way, they're watching for me." They circled the building, looking for another way in. The back entrance was watched as well, but more casually, one man smoking a pipe and apparently enjoying the morning air. This was the kind of loose surveillance that suggested the watchers weren't entirely sure their target would appear, but wanted to be ready if he did. "There's an alley behind the building," Lone Eagle observed. "Looks like it connects to the next street over. We might be able to get in through a back window." But before they could attempt entry, a woman emerged from the boarding house, middle-aged, well-dressed, with the purposeful stride of someone on an important mission. She walked directly toward them, apparently having spotted them during their reconnaissance. "You must be Dawn's father," she said without preamble. "I'm Mrs. Henderson, and I've been watching for you." Lone Eagle's hand moved instinctively toward his concealed weapon, but the woman's manner suggested help rather than threat. "Dawn described you perfectly," she continued. "Said you'd be cautious about approaching, probably spot the men watching the house. She's been worried sick that you'd see them and leave without visiting." "Who are those men?" "Federal marshals, mostly, but there's bounty hunters mixed in too. They've been here 3 days, ever since word got out that the Lakota killer might be coming to Denver." "How did word get out?" Mrs. Henderson's expression darkened. "That's what's been troubling Dawn. Nobody should have known about her letter. To you, but somehow the authorities found out. She's convinced someone's been reading her mail or following her visitors." The pieces were clicking together in Lone Eagle's mind with sickening clarity. Black Wolf wasn't just using his reputation. He was actively manipulating the situation to force a confrontation. Somehow he had learned about Dawn's illness and Lone Eagle's connection to her. The timing wasn't coincidental. "Is there another way to see her?" he asked. "There might be. Dawn's room is on the 2nd floor, facing the alley. If you could get to the roof of the building next door, you might be able to reach her window. But it would be dangerous. If those marshals spot you, they'll shoot first and ask questions later." As they discussed options, Birdie had been studying the wanted posters with growing confusion. Finally, she tugged on Lone Eagle's sleeve. "Look at this," she said, pointing to one of the newer posters. "Look at the date. The poster was dated 3 days ago, but it described crimes that had supposedly occurred the previous week, including the supply wagon attack they had witnessed the aftermath of during their journey south." "That's impossible," Lone Eagle said. This poster was printed before those crimes happened. Mrs. Henderson leaned closer to examine the dates. You're right. But how? Someone planned the crimes in advance, Lone Eagle said grimly. Planned them, printed evidence to implicate me, and then carried them out on schedule. The implication was staggering. This wasn't random violence by a former warrior who had turned criminal. This was a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to frame Lone Eagle for a specific purpose. But what purpose? We need to see Dawn, he said. She might have information that explains what's really happening here. They waited until early evening, when the watchers would be tired from a long day of surveillance and the approaching darkness would provide cover. Lone Eagle left his distinctive rifle behind and dressed in the most anonymous clothes they could find, while Birdie created a diversion by approaching the front door as if she were a local child delivering a message. The plan worked well enough to get Lone Eagle onto the roof of the adjacent building, where he could see into Dawn's second-floor room. What he saw there made him forget all concerns about stealth and caution. His daughter was dying. She lay in a narrow bed, her face gaunt and pale, her breathing labored and shallow. But her eyes were alert and focused on the window, as if she had been watching for him. When she saw his silhouette against the evening sky, her face lit up with a joy that cut through his heart like a blade. He managed to raise the window and climb inside without attracting attention from the street. Dawn struggled to sit up as he approached her bed, and for a moment they simply stared at each other, father and daughter, meeting for the first time after 30 years of separation. "You came," she whispered. "I'm sorry it took so long. You're here now. That's what matters." She was even more beautiful than her photograph had suggested, with the kind of inner strength that showed in her eyes, despite her physical frailness. Looking at her, Lone Eagle could see both his own features and those of her mother, the gentle woman who had shown him kindness so many years ago. "Dawn, I need to ask you something important," he said urgently. "The men watching this house, did anyone know you had written to me?" "Only Dr. Peterson, the physician who's been treating me. I asked him to help me find you. Said I had a letter that needed to be delivered to my father. He's the one who suggested using a traveling merchant to carry it." "What did you tell him about me?" "Just that you were my father, that your name was Lone Eagle, and that you were probably living somewhere in Wyoming territory." Her expression grew troubled. "Why? Is something wrong?" "Someone's been committing crimes in my name, using information that only a close friend would have. But if Dr. Peterson knew about our connection..." Dawn's eyes widened with understanding and fear. "Oh God, I think I made a terrible mistake." "What kind of mistake?" "Dr. Peterson. His first name is Benjamin, but the nurses sometimes call him by his Indian name." She paused, struggling for breath. "They call him Black Wolf." The revelation hit Lone Eagle like a physical blow. Black Wolf, his closest friend, his brother-in-arms, had not only betrayed their warrior bond, but had used his own daughter's illness as bait in an elaborate trap. The scope of the deception was breathtaking in its cruelty. "How long has he been your doctor?" Lone Eagle asked, his voice carefully controlled despite the rage building in his chest. 6 months, Dawn whispered. "He's been so kind, so attentive. He never charged me full price for his services, said he understood what it was like for our people to struggle in the white world." Her voice broke. "I trusted him completely. When I told him about wanting to find my father before I died, he seemed so eager to help. He's been planning this for months," Lone Eagle said, the tactical implications becoming clear. "Using your illness to draw me out of hiding, setting up the crimes to frame me, arranging for law enforcement to be waiting when I arrived. But why? What does he gain from destroying you?" It was a question that cut to the heart of something Lone Eagle had been avoiding for 15 years. Black Wolf had always been the more ambitious of the two warriors, the one who dreamed of united tribes and glorious victories. When the Indian Wars ended and Lone Eagle chose exile, Black Wolf had seen it as abandonment, not just of their friendship, but of their people's cause. He wants to be remembered as the greatest warrior, Lone Eagle said slowly. And the only way to achieve that is to destroy the reputation of the man who overshadowed him. Dawn struggled to sit up straighter, her breathing labored but her eyes fierce. He's using my death as part of his plan, isn't he? Making sure you'd have to come here where he could control the situation. Before Lone Eagle could answer, they heard footsteps in the hallway outside Dawn's room. Heavy boots moving with purpose toward her door. He moved quickly to the window, preparing to escape the way he had entered, but froze when he heard a familiar voice. "I know you're in there. Old friend," Black Wolf's voice carried easily through the thin door. "Why don't we talk like civilized men instead of playing games?" "Go," Dawn whispered urgently. "Get out while you can." But it was too late. The sound of boots on the stairs indicated that men were climbing to the roof, cutting off his escape. Brute, Black Wolf had anticipated every move, just as he had always done during their warrior days. "I have men surrounding the building," Black Wolf continued conversationally. "Federal marshals, bounty hunters, even some of my young followers who are eager to see the legendary Lakota killer in action. You're trapped, just like I planned." Lone Eagle moved away from the window and positioned himself where he could see the door while remaining partially concealed. His hand found the grip of his concealed pistol, but he didn't draw it. "Not yet. What do you want, Benjamin?" he called out, using Black Wolf's white name deliberately. "I want what's mine. The recognition, the reputation, the place in history. That should have been mine all along." The door handle turned slowly. "You had everything. The respect of warriors, the fear of enemies, the songs that celebrated your victories. And then you threw it all away for what? To live like a hermit, forgotten and alone. I chose peace. You chose cowardice." The door opened, and Black Wolf stepped into the room. 30 years had changed him dramatically, where once he had been. Lean and quick, now he carried the soft weight of a man who lived indoors and ate regular meals. His hair was shorter, styled in the white fashion, and he wore the dark suit of a professional man. But his eyes still held the calculating intelligence that had made him such a formidable warrior. "You abandoned our people when they needed strong leaders," he continued, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of speeches given many times before. "You left me to carry on the fight alone." "What fight?" Lone Eagle stepped into view, his hands visible but ready. "The wars were over. Our people were learning to survive in a changed world. There was no more fight. There's always a fight for men like us. We're warriors. It's what we were born to be." Black Wolf's gaze shifted to Dawn, lying pale and still in her bed. "Your daughter understood that. She was so proud when I told her stories about her father's great victories. You told her lies to manipulate her into trusting you. I told her the truth about what you could have been if you hadn't lost your courage." Black Wolf moved closer to the bed, his proximity to Dawn a clear threat. She wanted so desperately to reconnect with her heroic father. It was touching, really. Lone Eagle felt the familiar battle calm settling over him, the heightened awareness and focused intensity that had kept him alive through countless fights. But this was different from the old days. Now he was fighting, not just for his own survival, but to protect the two most important people in his world. "The young men you've been leading," he said, hoping to reach whatever conscience might remain. "In his former friend, they're going to die because of your lies. Their families will mourn while you live comfortably in Denver, playing doctor. They'll die as warriors, fighting for something greater than themselves. It's more than you've given them. I've given them peace. The chance to build new lives without the weight of old hatreds." Black Wolf laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Peace. Look around you, Lone Eagle. Our people are dying of disease and despair on reservations. Our children are being stolen and sent to schools that teach them to be ashamed of their heritage. There is no peace, only surrender, disguised with pretty words." The philosophical argument was one they had fought many times during the transition, years after the wars ended. But now it carried the weight of 3 decades of different choices, different paths that had led to this confrontation. "So you decided to become a criminal," Lone Eagle said, to lead young men into death while you stayed safe in the background. I decided to remind the world that we still exist, that we're still dangerous when we need to be." Black Wolf's hand moved toward his coat, where the outline of a weapon was visible, "and I decided to claim my rightful place as the greatest warrior of our generation. By destroying me? By proving that you were never as great as the stories claimed. When the bounty hunters kill you here tonight, when the newspapers write about how the famous Lakota killer died cornered like a rat in a boarding house, the legend will be broken. And my legend, the doctor who helped bring you to justice, will take its place." Dawn's voice, weak but clear, cut through the tension. "You're not a warrior. You're just a bitter old man who can't accept that the world moved on without you." Black Wolf's face darkened with rage. "You don't understand what your father stole from me. The glory, the recognition." "He stole nothing," she said firmly. "You gave it away when you chose hatred over healing." The sound of movement in the hallway indicated that Black Wolf's men were getting impatient. Shouts from the street suggested that a crowd was gathering, drawn by the promise of witnessing the capture of the notorious Lakota killer. "It's time," Black Wolf said, drawing a Colt revolver from his coat. "The federal marshals are expecting to find your body when they break down that door. Resisting arrest, they'll say, forced to use deadly force to protect innocent civilians." But as he raised the weapon, a small figure burst through the window behind him. Birdie had climbed the fire escape on the building's exterior, timing her entrance perfectly to catch Black Wolf off guard. "Get away from them," she shouted, wielding a heavy piece of broken brick like a weapon. The distraction was exactly what Lone Eagle needed. Years of exile had dulled his reflexes, but not eliminated them. He moved with the fluid grace of a born warrior, closing the distance between himself and Black Wolf before the other man could react to Birdie's sudden appearance. But Black Wolf was also a trained fighter, despite the years of soft living. He spun toward Lone Eagle's charge, bringing his gun around in a practiced motion that spoke of countless hours of training. The two men collided in the center of the small room, their struggle immediate and deadly. Dawn's bed shook with the impact, and medical equipment crashed to the floor as they fought for control of the weapon. Outside, the sound of boots pounding up the stairs indicated that time was running out. In moments, Black Wolf's allies would break down the door, and the carefully orchestrated trap would snap shut around all of them. "Birdie!" Lone Eagle gasped as he grappled with his former friend. "The sacred war paint in my pack." She understood immediately. If this was to be his final battle, he would face it not as a broken exile, but as Lone Eagle, warrior of the Lakota people. As she scrambled to find his traveling pack, the two aging warriors continued their deadly dance, each drawing on skills honed in the crucible of the Indian Wars. The irony was not lost on Lone Eagle that after 15 years of peaceful exile, he was about to face his greatest battle in a Denver boarding house room, fighting to protect the daughter he had never known and the child who had become his hope for the future. The door exploded inward just as Birdie found the small pouch containing his ceremonial paint. Federal marshals poured into the room, weapons drawn, expecting to find a cornered fugitive ready to surrender. Instead, they found two legendary warriors locked in mortal combat, while a young girl with fierce green eyes stood guard over a dying woman's bedside, holding a hawk feather like a battle standard. In the chaos of the marshal's arrival, everything seemed to happen at once and in slow motion. Black Wolf used the distraction to break free from Lone Eagle's grip, raising his pistol toward Dawn's bed with the clear intention of eliminating the witness who could expose his true identity. But Lone Eagle had spent a lifetime reading the intentions of enemies in battle. He threw himself between the gun and his daughter, feeling the impact of the bullet tear through his shoulder as he crashed into Black Wolf's legs, bringing them both to the ground. "Don't shoot!" Dawn's voice rang out with surprising strength. Over the chaos, That man is Dr. Benjamin Peterson. He's been treating me for months. The real criminal is the one on the floor with the gun." The federal marshals hesitated, weapons trained on both men, but uncertain who posed the real threat. In that moment of confusion, Birdie acted with the quick thinking of someone who had learned to survive by reading situations faster than adults. She grabbed Dawn's Bible from the bedside table, the leather-bound book that had been Dawn's constant companion through her illness, and threw it with startling accuracy at Black Wolf's gun hand. The heavy book struck just as he was trying to line up another shot, sending the pistol skittering across the floor. "He's the doctor who's been poisoning her," Birdie shouted, "making her sicker instead of better so she'd stay here longer." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Dawn's eyes widened with the terrible recognition of truth, the gradual worsening of her condition despite Black Wolf's treatments, the way he had always discouraged her from seeking second opinions, the convenient timing of her decline coinciding with his increased interest in her family history. "That's impossible," one of the marshals said, but his voice carried uncertainty. "Check his medical bag," Dawn said, her voice growing stronger as pieces fell into place. "Check what he's been giving me for medicine." Black Wolf struggled to his feet, blood running from a cut on his forehead where he had struck the floor. Gone was the composed professional manner he had maintained moments before. Now he looked like what he truly was, a desperate man whose elaborate scheme was collapsing around him. "You fools," he snarled at the marshals. "I'm Dr. Benjamin Peterson. I've been helping you track the Lakota killer. This man is a vicious criminal who broke into my patient's room." But even as he spoke, his story was unraveling. The marshal, who had questioned Lone Eagle weeks earlier, stepped forward, studying Black Wolf's face with growing recognition. "I remember you," he said slowly. "You were in my office 3 days ago, providing information about Lone Eagle's possible whereabouts. Said you were a concerned citizen who'd heard stories." His eyes narrowed. "But you knew too much, details that weren't in any official reports." "Of course I knew details. I've been treating his daughter. She told me stories about her father. Stories that haven't been told in 30 years, Lone Eagle said, pressing a hand to his bleeding shoulder. Stories that only someone who was there would know. Dawn struggled to sit up higher in her bed, her breathing labored, but her voice clear. "Show them your arms, Dr. Peterson. Show them the scars you always kept covered." Black Wolf instinctively pulled his sleeves down, but it was too late. The marshals had seen the glimpse of old battle scars, the kind that came from arrows and knives, not from medical school or civilian life. "I've been looking for the wrong man," the marshal said quietly. "Haven't I, Black Wolf?" The use of his warrior name was like a key turning in a lock. Black Wolf's careful facade cracked completely, revealing the bitter, angry man beneath. "You want to know the truth?" he said, his voice rising with decades of suppressed rage. "Yes, I'm Black Wolf. Yes, I've been leading raids against the people who stole our land and murdered our children. And yes, I used that coward's reputation to cover my tracks." The admission sent a ripple of shock through the room. The marshals exchanged glances, understanding that their months-long manhunt had been based on carefully planted false information. "But I'm not the villain here," Black Wolf continued, pointing at Lone Eagle. "He's the one who abandoned our people when they needed him most. He's the one who chose comfort over courage, exile over action. I chose life over death," Lone Eagle replied. "For myself, and for anyone who might have followed me into more pointless battles." "Pointless." Black Wolf's voice cracked with emotion. "Our people are dying on reservations. Our children are being stolen and brainwashed. Our sacred lands are being strip-mined for gold. But you call resistance pointless? I call leading young men to their deaths for your own glory pointless." The philosophical argument that had driven them apart decades ago was playing out in its final form, witnessed by federal marshals, a dying woman, and a fierce young girl who understood more about family loyalty than either aging warrior. Dawn's voice cut through their debate with the authority of someone facing death. "Stop," she said firmly. "Both of you, stop this foolishness. Benjamin, you've betrayed everything a healer should stand for. And Father—" She looked directly at Lone Eagle, with eyes full of love and forgiveness. "You've punished yourself long enough for choices you made when the world was different." The moment of truth hung heavy in the room, like smoke from a sacred fire. Black Wolf stood cornered, his carefully constructed deception exposed, but he still carried the dangerous unpredictability of a wounded animal. His eyes darted between the marshal's drawn weapons and the window behind him, calculating odds with the tactical mind that had once made him formidable. "You think you've won," he said to Lone Eagle, his voice thick with bitter resignation. "But even if they arrest me, the damage is done. Your reputation is destroyed. Every crime I committed in your name will be remembered long after the truth comes out." "Maybe," Lone Eagle said quietly, "but the truth has a way of surviving lies, even when it takes time." Pretty words from a man who spent 15 years hiding from the world. "I wasn't hiding from the world. I was learning to live in it without destroying everything I touched." Black Wolf's laugh was harsh and broken. "And what did that accomplish? Our people are still suffering. The white man still takes what he wants. Your noble exile changed nothing." "It changed me," Lone Eagle said simply, "and maybe that's enough." The philosophical divide between them was unbridgeable, carved by 3 decades of different choices. But there was still the practical matter of Black Wolf's surrender, and he showed no intention of surrendering peacefully. Instead, he lunged toward Dawn's bed, grabbing a scalpel from his medical bag with the desperate speed of a man with nothing left to lose. The marshals couldn't risk shooting with Dawn and Birdie so close to the line of fire. "Stay back," he warned, holding the blade near Dawn's throat. "I'll kill her rather than let you parade me around like a trophy." But his attention was focused entirely on the armed marshals, and he had forgotten the most dangerous person in the room. Birdie had learned to survive on the streets of Copper Creek by being faster and more ruthless than people expected from a small girl. She moved like lightning, grabbing the heavy ceramic water pitcher from Dawn's bedside table and bringing it down on Black Wolf's wrist with all her strength. The scalpel flew from his numbed fingers as he cried out in pain. In that same instant, Lone Eagle moved with the fluid grace he had thought lost to age and exile. He caught Black Wolf's arm, twisted with practiced efficiency, and brought his former friend to the ground in a hold that was controlling, but not deadly. "It's over," he said quietly. Black Wolf struggled briefly, then went limp with the exhaustion of a man whose grand schemes had collapsed into ruin. "You always were faster than me," he said, his voice hollow with defeat. "Speed was never our difference," Lone Eagle replied. "You were always as fast as me, as strong as me, as skilled as me. Our difference was that I learned when to stop fighting." The marshals moved in quickly, securing Black Wolf with handcuffs and tending to the various injuries sustained in the struggle. But even as the immediate crisis ended, the weight of revelation hung over everyone in the room. "How many young men died because of your lies?" the lead marshal asked Black Wolf as he was being restrained. "They died as warriors," Black Wolf said, but his voice lacked conviction. "They died fighting for something they believed in. They died because you fed them stories about glory that belonged to another man," Lone Eagle said, "and because you were too proud to let the war end." As the authorities led Black Wolf away, he turned back for one last look at his former friend. "You could have been remembered as the greatest warrior who ever lived," he said. "Instead, you'll be forgotten like all the rest." "Maybe," Lone Eagle said, "but I'll be remembered by the people who matter to me, and that's enough." When the room finally cleared of officials and the immediate chaos subsided, Lone Eagle found himself alone with Dawn and Birdie. His shoulder throbbed where Black Wolf's bullet had grazed him, but the wound was superficial. Another scar to add to his collection. "Father," Dawn said softly, and the word carried 30 years of longing. He took her hand, feeling how fragile it was, how little time they had together. "I'm sorry I wasn't there for your life," he said. All the important moments, all the times when you needed a father. You're here now, she whispered, for the most important moment of all. Outside the window, Denver continued its bustling life, unaware that one of the most wanted men in the territory had just been cleared of all charges. But inside the small boarding house room, 3 people who had found each other against impossible odds were writing the final chapter of one story and the first chapter of another. Dawn's breathing was growing more labored, but her eyes remained bright with the joy of a woman who had lived to see her greatest wish fulfilled. She had her father beside her, holding her hand. She had a great-granddaughter who would carry forward the family's story, and she had the peace that comes from knowing that love, however briefly experienced, was worth every moment of waiting. "Tell me about the old days," she said. "Tell me about my mother, about the woman who loved you enough to let you go." 6 months later, the spring sun warmed the small ranch that Lone Eagle and Birdie had purchased with the reward money offered for Black Wolf's capture. The irony wasn't lost on him that his former friend's crimes had provided the means for building the new life they now shared. The ranch sat in a gentle valley 30 miles outside Denver, far enough from the city to provide privacy, but close enough for Birdie to attend the local school 3 days a week. She had insisted on continuing her education, declaring that Dawn would have wanted her to use her mind as well as her survival instincts. "Grandpa Lone Eagle," she called from the vegetable garden where she was planting the 3 sisters. Corn, beans, and squash, in the traditional way he had taught her. The title had evolved naturally from their early days together, and neither of them questioned its accuracy anymore. Family was what you built together, not just what blood gave you. "The seeds are in the ground," she announced with satisfaction. "Think they'll grow as good here as they did at your old camp?" "Better," he said, looking up from the small wooden doll he was carving for her birthday next month. "The soil here is rich, and they'll have someone who cares about them tending them every day." The doll was taking shape under his patient knife. Work. A Lakota girl in traditional dress, with Birdie's determined chin and bright eyes. It would join the growing collection of handmade toys and tools he had created for her, each one carrying a story or lesson from the old ways. Their morning routine had evolved into something that felt as natural as breathing. Prayers at sunrise, shared breakfast, lessons in traditional skills mixed with practical ranch work, and always the evening conversations that had become the heart of their relationship. But today was different. Today marked 6 months since Dawn's peaceful death, and they were preparing for a special ceremony. "You ready for the memorial?" he asked. Birdie nodded solemnly. "Got the sage ready, and the sweetgrass, and I practiced the songs you taught me." They rode together to the small hill behind their house where they had built a traditional memorial structure. Not a grave, since Dawn had been buried in the Denver cemetery, but a place to honor her spirit and the connection she had created between them. The ceremony was simple but profound. They burned sage for purification and sweetgrass for prayers, offering tobacco to the 4 directions and speaking Dawn's name to ensure her spirit knew she was remembered. Birdie's voice was clear and strong as she sang the Lakota songs Lone Eagle had taught her, her pronunciation improving with each practice. "I think she would have liked this place," Birdie said as they sat in comfortable silence afterward. "I think she would have liked seeing you happy and strong," Lone Eagle replied. "That's what she wanted most, for you to know where you belonged in the world. Do you think Black Wolf will ever understand what he did wrong?" It was a question she asked periodically, trying to make sense of how someone who had once been good could choose to do such terrible things. Lone Eagle had given it considerable thought during the long winter evenings. "Maybe someday," he said. "Prison gives a man time to think about his choices, but understanding and changing are different things." Black Wolf had been sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for the murders committed during his false flag campaign. His young followers had been treated more leniently, since most were judged to have been misled rather than inherently criminal. Some had returned to their reservations, others had found work in the cities, a few had even come to visit the ranch, seeking guidance from the legendary warrior who had chosen peace. "I hope he finds peace," Birdie said simply. Anger made him do awful things. Her capacity for forgiveness continued to amaze Lone Eagle. At 9 years old, she had experienced more loss and hardship than many adults. Yet she approached the world with an open heart and fierce loyalty to the people she loved. The local school had initially been skeptical about accepting a half-Indian girl being raised by a former warrior, but Birdie's quick intelligence and determined personality had won over teachers and classmates alike. She could recite multiplication tables as easily as traditional stories, write essays in perfect English, and track animals through the forest with equal skill. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" her teacher had asked during a recent parent conference. "Someone who helps people remember important things," Birdie had replied without hesitation. Walking back toward the ranch house as the sun set behind the mountains, Lone Eagle reflected on the unexpected path his life had taken. A year ago, he had been a hermit, convinced that his story was over and his usefulness to the world had ended. Now he was a father figure to a remarkable child, a small rancher building something lasting, and a keeper of traditions that would live on through another generation. "Grandpa?" Birdie's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Do you ever miss the old days? The excitement and adventures?" He considered the question seriously, as he did all her inquiries about life and meaning. "I miss some things," he said finally. "I miss the closeness I had with other warriors, the sense of fighting for something important, but I don't miss the anger or the fear or the way violence made everything else smaller." "What about now? What do you like about now?" "I like watching. You learn new things every day. I like building something that will last instead of destroying things that can't be replaced. I like being someone's grandfather instead of someone's nightmare. And I like having a family," Birdie said simply. As they approached the house, smoke rising from the chimney and lamplight glowing warmly in the windows, Lone Eagle understood that Dawn's greatest gift hadn't been the letter that brought them together. It had been her faith that two lost people could become found by caring for each other. The handmade doll in his workshop waited for finishing touches. Tomorrow's lessons needed planning, and the evening's stories were already forming in his mind. At 63, Lone Eagle had finally learned the most important truth of all. The best adventures were the quiet ones, built day by day with people who mattered. Behind them, the memorial structure stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, a bridge between the old life and the new, between the warriors they had been and the family they had chosen to become. And in the growing darkness, if you knew how to listen, you could almost hear Dawn's voice on the wind, blessing the life her sacrifice had made possible.